interested in something for next year potentially, but would love to just get an update, hear where we are and people's thoughts about where the state is at with wake boats. So to kick us off, we have folks from DC and A&R. So welcome. Do you want to come up separately or together?
Maybe we can come up together.
Amazing.
Your preference.
Sure.
Oh, there we go. Pretty. So for the record, my name is Bethany Sargent. I am the Deputy Director in the Watershed Management Division, and I'm joined by Laura Guidoletti. So I'm going to kick us off, and before we get too deep into wake boats and wake sports, I wanted to provide a little background on the use of public water rules, which is the set of rules that contains our wake sports rule. So the authority for the use of public water rules comes to us from 10 VSA 1424. The rules were adopted in 1994, and they were originally administered by the Natural Resources Board, and within that, the Water Resources Panel. The administration of those rules came to the Agency of Natural Resources in 2012 through Act 138. And the use of public water rules apply to lakes, ponds, and reservoirs in Vermont. And really, the purpose of the rules is to allow Vermonters and visitors to use these shared resources in a reasonable manner, and also to minimize any conflicts between those recreational uses. So those, the UPWs, which is how we refer to them, can potentially restrict what type of watercraft may be used. They may address certain speeds, boat size, motor size, moorings, those sorts of things within those rules. So the way that they're structured, there are rules that apply to all lakes, ponds, and reservoirs. There are rules that are specific to those that are wholly within Vermont, which is, we refer to those as sort of our inland lakes. And there are rules that are specific to individual water bodies. So examples of those specific water body rules, there may be a prohibition of vessels greater than 5 miles per hour, prohibitions of use of personal watercraft like jet skis. The Agency of Natural Resources in administering the rules can conduct rulemaking of its own accord or in response to a petition. The enforcement of these rules is delegated to the Department of Motor Vehicles, which enforcement is carried out by Vermont State Police, the Marine Division, as well as our Vermont Fish and Wildlife game wardens. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura to talk briefly about some definitions that are key. The other thing I want to mention just also about the use of public water rules is that we do have the ability to delegate rules to a municipality that's adjacent to a water body, as long as that municipality has that delegation authority through a municipal ordinance or bylaw. And so it does provide that ability to the agency. I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you. So my name is Laura Guidoletti, and I work in the Lakes and Ponds program of the Watershed Management Division. And I kind of wanted to just start off with a little bit of framing because you all may not be as intimately familiar with wake sports as we are. So a wake boat is a type of boat that has that can create a large wake or a wave. Typically, they have large ballast tanks or bags that they can enter a lake and fill up with water. And this light weight makes them heavier, and they tend to travel at slower speeds to create a large wake, and then people recreate on these wakes. And so sometimes there's some confusion because other motorboats, typical, ski boats, pontoon boats, they create wakes, but those are not wake boats. Wake boats are these boats specifically designed to create a large wake. And then wake sports is when those wake boats are operating in wake sports mode, when they are creating the large wake, we call that wake sports, and also when people are recreating on those large wakes, so if they're surfing or whatever, riding those big wakes, we call that wake sports. And that's what a lot of what our existing rule regulates. Wake boats have the ability to operate like a traditional motorboat. They don't have to have their ballast tanks filled and they don't have to create a big wake. So, oh, and I wanted to say that we don't really have a great way to estimate how many boats, how many wake boats are in Vermont in total. Because at the Department of Motor Vehicles, when people register their boats, there isn't an option to say what kind of boat or whether or not it's a wake boat. So based on some national sales data, we estimate that there's probably around between 100 and 200 wake boats in Vermont. So the Department of Environmental Conservation went through a pretty lengthy rulemaking process to adopt a new rule under the use of public waters rules to regulate wake sports. And the rule went into effect for this past spring season in 2024. The rule was developed with extensive public input from stakeholders. We had pre-rulemaking public meetings, we met with affected user groups. And we did a deep dive into scientific literature about wave science. And really we're looking for what are the environmental impacts from these large waves and where could they occur that would minimize these environmental impacts. And the rule that we came up with was that we needed to have 50 contiguous acres of lake or pond that was 500 feet from shore on all sides and at least 20 feet deep. And that's to keep the downward propulsion of the wake sports from stirring up bottom sediments and to allow enough space for these large wakes to dissipate before hitting the shore and creating shoreline erosion. So based on this criteria of this rule, there are 30 inland lakes that can support a wake sports zone. The rule also contains some criteria about decontamination of wake boats and traveling between lakes, and there is a home lake provision in there intended to help reduce the spread of wake boats of aquatic invasive species. And this rule was adopted in response to a petition that we received from the public. And this final rule is different than what the petitioners proposed. We closely followed the guidelines of the use of public waters rules that lay out as a requirement that when we're resolving conflicts between uses, we need to find the least restrictive way possible to manage that user conflict that's still protective of all of our guidelines.
Next question. And who are the petitioners?
The responsible wakes for Vermont lakes.
Okay, thank you.
It's a question.
Yes.
You said it doesn't apply to Men for Magog and Champlain, so what applies to them? Is there any rule that applies to wake boats on those lakes?
They have to follow the other boating safety rules, but they're still subject to decontamination requirements. But there aren't defined wake sports zones on those lakes. So they're required to stay 200 feet from shore without creating wake. But there are no specific wake sports zones identified.
Okay, so wake sporting is allowed on
Yes.
those two lakes?
Yeah.
Okay.
When was that petition filed?
I believe it was 2022.
March 2022.
Okay, thank you. So, in looking back on our 1 year implementation of this rule, there's some huge caveats with this information because it is really only 1 year of information. But the first year that the rule was in place, we didn't have any substantiated violations reported to law enforcement. And, obviously, we know that not every possible violation of the rules were reported or even seen, but there were no official violations logged by law enforcement. There were a small handful of complaints made, but none of them were substantiated. Some of them were after the fact or just not really pertinent to the rules. Also, as we look back on how this first year went, we worked closely with public access area greeters. And I don't know how familiar with these, but at the Vermont Fish and Wildlife access areas, there are public access greeters who play a really important role in meeting with boats launching into public waters and providing them education and resources to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. So these greeters play a really important role in spread prevention in Vermont, but they also collect data about what kind of boats are entering the water and where those boats were last. So we have some information kind of showing just a snapshot from this past year. And based on their data, about 1% of the boats launched into public waters were wake boats. And very few boats were traveling between lakes. So one boat, a wake boat, would typically return to the same lake over and over, which is good for spread prevention, but it does happen, boats travel between lakes. And again, this data just is a snapshot of where there are public access readers, and they're not manned 24/7, so it's the information we have. And we also spoke with lots of folks around lakes to understand if this new rule changed wake sports behavior on their lakes. Meaning, did a lake that never really had wake sports, but now has a wake sports zone, did wake boats flock to those lakes? And we didn't get any reports of that, nor did we see wake sports necessarily increase on the lakes where wake sports after the passage of this rule. So, but that's just 1 year, and last year was a very rainy year. So again, there are caveats with this information, but this is what we have.
So question for you,
Yeah.
on the decontamination question, so you had a list of criteria for wake sports zones. 50 acres, contiguous, more than 20 feet deep. Was one, I don't think this is one of the criteria, but I just want to verify that one of the criteria was that it did not include having a decontamination facility.
Right,
Right.
yeah, in order to have a wake sports zone, there's no requirement to
Right,
have a
okay.
facility. That's correct.
Thanks.
But another thing that became very clear after this, reflecting on this last year of this rule implementation, is that our existing decontamination infrastructure across the state is insufficient to handle the decontamination of wake boats, and frankly, a lot of our boats, because it's not just wake boats recreating. So while we were implementing this new statewide rule, we began receiving petitions from some of the 30 lakes that were eligible for wake sports. Some of the petitions came in before the new rules implemented, and many came in early in the summer. In total, we've received 10 petitions representing 11 lakes that are currently eligible for wake sports, and they have requested to prohibit wake sports on those individual lakes. Except for one petition that came much later, all the other 9 petitions were reviewed together. We held public meetings that were really well attended. We had a lot of public input. And we took the information from the public comments we received. You can see we had 581 comments. We went through every single one of them, went through the information in the petition, as well as some of the information we have in this first year of implementation. And I would say that, there was a lot of support for these petitions in the public. Of course, there was a handful of opposition. There was maybe a larger handful of folks who wanted to give the new rule a little bit more time to play out and see if it helped resolve conflicts. But there was a lot of, most of these comments were in support of these petitions. But in reviewing all these comments and all this information, a couple of things kind of shifted out for us, and that's that the existing wake sports rule needs some updating. And that our existing decontamination opportunities and the infrastructure around the state really need to be improved. And that by really focusing on improving this statewide rule, we'll have a more consistent and equitable approach to regulating wake sports across the state. Yes.
That last point, so what do you feel, or maybe what was determined to be not consistent and equitable about the current rule?
Well, for example, so it's about making decisions for going forward. So for example, if a lake petitions us to prohibit wake sports and we move forward on that position based on a certain set of criteria. But we aren't aware that perhaps other lakes who didn't petition have that exact same criteria.
Mhm,
We're kind of making decisions in an unequitable way between lakes,
mhm.
just because there's a petition. So we kind of want to look at the big picture of
Mhm.
all lakes rather than, that can.
Okay,
Yeah.
but didn't the current rule do that or not?
It did,
Okay,
yes, it did, the current rule is a statewide rule that applies to all lakes.
okay, so this is not saying that the current rule is not consistent and equitable, it's just if you update the rule, you wanna do it in a consistent and equitable way, okay?
Yes, good.
I don't see it in your other slides, but could you share with us? Who those 10 lake associations or municipalities and,
Yes,
I mean, not right now, but if you could send us a list, that'd be great.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
okay. I was gonna get quizzed.
No.
I do know that.
Do you have it?
Yeah, I can share that maybe at the end.
Sure, that'd be
Okay.
great, thank you.
So, as part of all these efforts that we're working on, so we're working on responding to petitions and reviewing the petitions. We have embarked on updating the statewide rule. Interconnected with those is also improving our decontamination services and opportunities across the state. And our spread prevention goals are much broader than just wake sports. As you know, I mentioned earlier, wake sports are a small part of the total recreational boating in Vermont. And you know, it is our policy to prevent the spread of invasive species. The spread concerns from wake boats are very real. We acknowledge that, but there is just a much bigger picture here, and we don't want to focus just on decontamination efforts on wake boats. So we started working with a working group, a decontamination working group. And this stakeholder group is exploring different short-term and long-term goals to improve decontamination across the state. And there'll be a report coming forth this summer. And hopefully also my understanding there's going to be a pilot program this summer with some additional hot water decontamination stations. Because, you know, as I mentioned, our existing infrastructure isn't really equipped to handle these very large boats and wake boat ballast tanks. So you need a lot of water, you need hot water. So we're working on having more opportunities across the state. And this is just a small pilot, but this is something that we hope to improve.
Yes, question.
Didn't we pass a bill in the last biennium about wake boats, and we approved it?
I think it was the rules, I
The
think.
rules, okay, so when do the rules implemented?
Last April, so April 2023.
And they were immediately implemented, right?
So for this next steps in our timeline in our process, you know, there aren't any immediate changes to the existing wake sports rule for this year. The wake sports rule as it exists is still in place. Wake boats are subject to inspections, just like any other watercraft. They're required to decontaminate. We will continue to have wake sports zone maps and resources and decontamination information on our website. But these three things, the response to these petitions we've received, our work on proposing updates to the statewide rule, and decontamination solutions. We're all working on these together and they're very connected. But our goal is for this spring to announce some public engagement meetings for our updated statewide rule, and then also roll out the response to the petitions. Hopefully having these meetings this summer. Late summer, the decontamination report should be available, and if all goes forward, these new rules will be ready for 2026.
Yes, good.
So, the public hearings,
Mhm,
I've got two of these lakes that are support wake boats in my district.
mhm.
I don't remember any public hearings that were, when were they, do you have dates when they were out and where they were located?
Are you talking about for the petitions?
Right.
So we had two in December, and there was one in Newport and one in Montpelier.
How did you advertise?
I believe we did a press release. And
It was a press
there was a
release.
press release and, a lot of folks who commented on the original wake sports rule, were notified. The petitioners were also spreading the news quite widely about.
We also had asked the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds to share it with their members as well. And those meetings were both virtual, so you could attend remotely through Microsoft Teams as well as in person.
And, you know, I belong to the Lake St. Catherine's Association, I don't remember hearing.
So Lake St. Catherine has not submitted a petition. So it might not have been,
They put on both,
Oh.
if there was a wake boat,
yeah,
hearing, I would think they would.
So-
And I was just gonna say, and so those public meetings were very specific to the petitions. And so, the process that is outlined here would be additional public meetings on overall on the use of public water rules, proposed changes, including those base sports. That would be prior to filing with ICAR.
But I don't mean to pick on the.
no.
Oh.
I would think that if Lake St. Catherine was a lake that would accept wake boats, that they should have been made aware of.
I think their point was that there was no petition related to St. Catherine and the hearings were specific to the petitions, so. that-
Yeah,
I
those,
guess my problem is that we need to let the public know.
Understood.
In a way that, if I wanna do something in my municipality, I gotta run it 3 days in a local paper and, anyway, just food for thought.
Yeah, Commissioner, thank you.
So you have a number of petitions in front of you now, and you're also thinking about or setting in motion a process for a new, are you going to go forward with those individual petitions in the meantime, or should you thinking to try to go all into one new state level?
So we haven't made formal determinations on the petitions yet. They have informed prospective changes that we're considering to the statewide rules. So we'll be making those formal determinations as an agency within the next month or so.
On
As
the petition,
on the individual petitions. And also kicking off a pre-rulemaking public process to get additional input onto a broader proposed suite of changes on the use of, for the use of public water.
I frankly don't see how you could ever have enough decontamination stations and enforcement to, because these things are, as I understand it, they're super spreaders. And there's so many places in Vermont you can just back up and butcher boat the lake. That creates all over the place and decontaminate, and so I'm just worried about this summer, actually, another summer of this. Is there anything you can do to at least, as an emergency basis, to at least keep these boats in the whole lake with a sticker, a whole lake sticker, or do anything to get through the summer without allowing them to continue to be supercars?
So, I guess, just to back up a little bit, so 10 VSA 1454 is what we refer to as our transport law. And it puts the onus on the vessel owner to not transport aquatic invasive species from one lake to another. It also, establishes our breeder program, which is really our, a really important partnership between the agency, municipalities and lake associations to do the inspections and also to run the decontamination stations. We have a protocol established that intent of which is to minimize risk, knowing that there aren't hot water decontamination equipment available that can handle, that has the volume of water available. So we have a protocol that recognizes that and provides for a lengthier drying time. There is a level of risk in recreating on surface waters and allowing members of the public to recreate in different surface waters. And I think a lot of, the question is, what is an acceptable level of risk? How do we weigh access to the public to our surface waters versus the risk of aquatic invasive species? And that is, that's something that we're trying to evaluate, because public access is a really important component in public access and allowing for different recreational uses. And that's what the use of public water rules lays out for us as an agency.
With that use of public waters set of rules, are they hierarchical? Like, does recreation supersede aquatic biota?
So the way that they're laid out, it gets pretty far down into the weeds in terms of the nomenclature, but they lay out normal uses. And so those are the uses, and Laura, feel free to jump in here, but those are the uses that were established on a lake as of January 1, 1993. The uses that were occurring at that time. And so the use of public waters rules is explicit to managing those uses and protecting those uses and minimizing conflicts while protecting those uses. And so how wake sports fits into that, obviously there weren't wake sports occurring in the same, at that time. There also weren't stand-up paddle boards, and there were recreation has evolved since then. And so those, in that sense, there is a hierarchical management of normal uses that need to be protected.
And so there's sort of a set of things that would supersede other.
Correct,
Use.
except it's not necessarily, the rules don't prohibit non-normal uses. And so it's that there's still the balancing of what does it mean to protect the use? And to what extent are other uses that may not have been occurring in 1993 impacting those uses that were. That's the way the rules are laid out for us.
And I realize this is not what you're talking about today, but just this line would be required to decontaminate if they did not pass an inspection. I've just been having other conversations separate from that, from wake boats specifically about, if a boater refuses or if
Right, there isn't an ability of the breeders to prohibit that boat from entering the water.
Anyway.
They are there as a service.
right, separate conversation, but
Yeah.
wanted to flag it.
Relevant,
I was like,
yeah.
oh, right, they're required to decontaminate.
And that's where, there is very much an interplay across a lot of these issues, and wake boats and wake sports has really catalyzed that discussion.
Yes, but
So I don't think.
then we probably need to move on.
The greeters can't enforce, they just.
Correct.
They have to go to, board and, for state police.
This was the end of my presentation, so if there are any additional questions, we'd be happy to entertain them.
Yes, go ahead.
Say, I am glad that you're looking at the new set of rules.
Did you share the list of lakes?
I have.
By the way, you consider, we don't have council members, that's actually it's fine in this.
And we didn't really get into what the potential new rules may look like. And recognize it may be premature to talk about that, but. You know, especially as we are considering things in this room, would love to know what is on your radar, as it becomes appropriate or available.
Certainly, my app will share that.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like me just to read out the links, or I can? Follow the email?
Or I'm just trying to see if there are any of my.
So, Lake Caspian and Echo Lake. Great April Lake and Little April Lake, Fairleigh, Shadow Lake and Glover, Waterbury Reservoir, Parker Lake, Lake Willoughby, and Joe's Pond.
All right, great, thank
And
you.
then we also received a petition from Harvey City, yeah, a little bit later in the process.
Okay, great, thank you so much. Okay, so we're gonna go now to some witnesses from the public. Speaking about this, so we're just gonna go right down the list as I have it here. So we're gonna start with Mr. Weidness. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here.
Yes, sure.
You see that?
Yes.
So my name's Jack Witness. I drove up this morning from Wilmington. See you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today because I know how busy you've been in these last weeks. The two messages I want to convey from our responsible lakes or Vermont Lakes group, I'll tell you about in just a minute. And we were the original petitioners that you asked about. And our view right now presently is that Vermont should prohibit wake sports on all inland lakes. And that an increase in DEC funding for aquatic invasive species, very important work, is much needed. So today, over the next 10 minutes or so, I'll tell you about the 4+ years that our group has been working on this problem. We spent for years to develop a petition, and then we filed, which you heard in March, but we're looking for a whole year before that. And I included much of what I'll say in a one-page handout that I hope you'll receive. And then today I'll be telling you the story, the chronology of events of our group and how we have worked to try to create the management of wake sports in Vermont. One of the items that I'm not going to spend time on, but I really draw your attention to the back of the handout. It's a very informative cartoon of many of the adverse events that can occur with wake boats and wake sports. So I encourage you to have a look at that to say it's on the back of your handout. So responsible wakes for Vermont lakes. What are they and who are they? So our group was formed in March of 2021, let's say a year before we submitted our petition. And we're a diverse group of citizens across the state who actively engaged in efforts to conserve and manage the resources of Vermont's lakes and ponds. We're also active users of Vermont's public waters. We're the boaters, the paddlers, the sailors, the anglers, and the swimmers. So I would say that our group members really know Vermont's lakes and really love Vermont's lakes. One of the things that our group has done is to try to increase education across the state and make the problems that can come with wake boats, which are significant, apparent. And so we've been somewhat successful, and here are two examples. One on the left is the pie graph is the 759, a little different number than Laura, because that's the number that we got from Oliver Pearson of the final written comments during the rulemaking period. And if you notice, the two large segments of the pie on the bottom, one indicates that the gray one, that 41% actually wanted the prohibition of all weight on this, and this is the written comments and public comments. And then 42% favored what our group was recommending, which was 1,000 feet from shore, as opposed to what the DEC recommended, which was 100. Other evidence of public support is if you've been reading the newspapers in your local area throughout the state during this making period, you had over 200 unsolicited items that people had submitted. And of these, less than 5% expressed opposition to developing the management for wave sports. So this was, I would say, hugely popular. During the course of our rulemaking process, we consulted experts, and several are shown here. They may be familiar to some of you. Some were members of the DEC or Fish and Wildlife, Vermont Center for Eco Studies. These are respected scientists in Vermont who know about lakes. And all three of the individuals shown here commented publicly on the adverse impacts of wake sports on the environment, and have recommended prohibition of wake sports on all lakes. Following the pre-rulemaking period, RWVL proposed a proposal for what we wanted was modified somewhat with by the ANR in the rulemaking, as Laura had mentioned. And I'm not going to go through these in great detail, but there were wake sport zones with different distances from shore and differences in depths. But the thing I'd like to emphasize is that for us, it was the home lake rule that was really so critically important as requiring a wake boat to just stay on a single lake for the season. This is to reduce the possible exposure of ballast water. And the thing I want to explain about ballast water is, unlike other boats, they take in between 3,000 and 5,000 or 6,000 pounds of water. And unlike other boats, when they dump the water, because you're not going to be driving around with a trailer with that much water in your boat, you're just not going to do it. You have to empty it out. But studies have conclusively shown that there's always water, and we're not talking about a few drops. In one study, the residual was 8.5 gallons of water. And I think you can imagine, small particles of living organisms, small parts of plants could be in that. So it's because of this that
Yes, sorry, if we can.
I can stop if you like.
Sure, we have a question.
Sure.
I just have a clarifying question about the feet from the shore, because I've heard you say two different things, and I thought I heard them say 200 feet. What is that
Okay.
rule, feet from the
Well,
shore?
the 200 was before we got into anything with having to do with wake boats, and that was established for motorized boats. So that applies to everything.
At all
and
boats,
everybody.
okay, and wake boats are 500 feet?
And just last,
Got
last April 15th, we went to 500.
Okay,
That was only for wake boats. It doesn't apply to motor boats.
right, and your group is recommending 1,000 feet?
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to get the footage clear in my head. All right, thank you, sorry to interrupt.
But the point I was making is that it's really the concern about the ballast water that was important to us. And in fact, when it came as a point to illustrate that, let me just say this first. You can see this graph. This shows the different decades along the y-axis and the number of infestations. And it starts back, actually, even 62 way over, but begins in the 80s. You can see the aquatic invasive species, which are these colored, have gone up tremendously in the state of Vermont. And the different colors that indicate different types of organisms. And in the upper right, there is the zebra mussel. And if you've been following the news, now zebra mussels are down in the United States. They had been in Canada. And one of the ways that these can be spread is through veligers, which are very tiny, small, early organisms that can be taken in with the ballast tanks. So I'm not saying that that's the cause, but this is a potential, but this is a very important area for us. So the rulemaking came to an end when LCAR met, and they met last year in February. And at the time, our group, Responsible Waste, voiced shortcomings about where things were at the particular time in terms of the DEC's proposed rules. We were concerned that the safety of wastewater issues were not considered in the application, and they admitted as such. They didn't have enough in-house expertise to look at that, which I think is important. They promised to look at this going forward, and I hope they're going to be looking at that in the individual lakes, I'll let the 10 petitions that Laura had mentioned. The other thing was, and this gets to the question you were asking about distance, we recommended 1,000 feet. You know, you can have an honest distance difference in terms of your interpretation of the science. And our sense of the science was that it really was 1,000 feet. And I would tell you we're not alone, because there's other places in the US where they do have a much greater distance. But anyhow, it's different than what the DEC, and that was our biggest bone of contention, but this was dismissed. In fact, the DEC staff made recommendations to the A&R for a greater distance.
And Mr. Winnes, I'm just conscious of time, so just be aware of where we've got to get through some of the folks.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we had some concerns. So let me move on more quickly. So during LCAR, DEC provided the strong assurance to us many times that the home lake rule would be in effect as it was written. And as you just heard, that's not been the case. So that was disappointing. So we reluctantly agreed to that. LCAR voted 7-1 in favor of the rule, but they were concerned. And in fact, they wrote your committee a letter about their concerns as to whether at the time wastewater should be allowed at all, and if allowed at what distances, and it should include safety type of issues. So what's happened since the enactment? Well, as you heard, the 10 lakes have applied. I'm not going to go through that. I would say the DEC, I would say, has failed to implement the home lake rule in 2024 because of decontamination, and the same is going to be happening, it looks like, in 2025. And then the thing that I would I'm a novice at this. I don't know how this works, but I was just shocked to hear that they're going to reopen on their own the 2024 rule. We thought it was in the books, but apparently it's not. And we don't have any idea, just as you don't. And we'd like to know about that, to comment on that. We'd like to think that maybe we have some expertise that they could use. So to finish up, our recommendations are: number one, to prohibit waste sports on all Vermont lakes, because we think this will protect the ecosystems. I haven't talked a lot about that, but others will. For the vast majority of traditional users, as opposed to those non-normal uses. We think it will improve by prohibiting them, will improve the public safety by removing waste sports. It will strengthen AIS prevention because of the issues of ballast tanks no longer being in the mix, and it will support the economy. One of the things we were required to do, and the DEC was required to do, is to provide an economic analysis. We had an extensive 10 or 12-page economic analysis showing a 10-1 favor of having management of weight boats versus not. And the DET pretty much totally adopted what we had. Again, our second recommendation is that the DEC needs increased funding, especially for AIS. This will enhance the ability of their staff to continue their all-important environmental stewardship for Vermont's inland lakes. And funding could come in part if there were a ban, and that there's no waste sport damage to the environment, because the waste sports are not operating in wastewater mode. There's little or no enforcement needed if they're no longer required, and it creates less expense for these state certified stations. So again, we're advocating provision of waste sports on all inland lakes, an increase in DEC funding in these areas to let DEC carry out their stewardship responsibilities in a favorable time and fashion. So I thank you. I'd be glad to answer questions or let other people talk and maybe come to questions later.
Any questions for Mr. Williams? Great, thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move to Pat Swayze, Swanson. So good. Welcome.
I did bring a village handout, but okay, I just kind of surround. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm Pat Swazi. I'm the president of the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds. The Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds is a volunteer coalition of lake associations and individuals. We are dedicated to fostering water quality standards and preserving Vermont's lakes, ponds, watersheds, and aquatic ecosystems. I'm going to start out. I want to talk a little bit more about aquatic invasive species. You know, it's been kind of mentioned, but I'd like to just dive in just for a minute on aquatic invasives, because that is actually related, as you heard, to what we're talking about. Aquatic invasive species disrupt the native ecosystem. They can impede recreational uses of water bodies and if allowed to grow completely out of control, can begin to reduce and kill really native fauna and flora. If you take a look at the handout, the second page shows, again, similar graph to what Jack just showed. It's just updated by the computers. And that blue line, that top blue line, that's the original water milfoil and growth of milfoil over these years since 2000, last 24 years. So it just gives you an idea of the spread that's happening. So for the inland lakes, and that's where I'm going to focus on the inland lakes because that's where the water, wakeboat rule applies. The two biggest concerns are zebra mussels and Eurasian water milfoil. Zebra mussels are not yet widespread in inland lakes. Up until recently, only Lake Bomazene was infested. However, just a few months ago, many of you probably heard, it was confirmed that zebra mussels have now spread from the Canadian side of Lake Memphremagog to the American side. Lake Memphremagog, just a few miles from some of the state's most pristine lakes in the Northeast Kingdom. This is a real concern. Making this development even more alarming is a recent research study from the University of Minnesota showing that the presence of zebra mussels is correlated with higher levels of mercury in fish in the lakes that they studied. And I've included on that handout, and I've also sent you an electronic version so you can get the links, a link to that particular study. The University of Minnesota is highly regarded in terms of their research on water issues and lake issues particularly. We look to them often for the level of their research. You know, this, in our opinion, is all the more reason to be very concerned about the possibility of the spread of zebra mussels. And with the movement on that, the American side of Lake Memphremagog, we're particularly concerned. Eurasian water milfoil, on the other hand, as you can see from the graph, is already infesting many of our inland lakes, and it's continuing to spread. Less than 3 years ago, Lake Evening discovered milfoil infestation, and this past August, Joe's Pond was also added to the list. Milfoil is a hardy plant that easily outcomes native aquatic vegetation. It tolerates a wide variety of temperatures, but doesn't mind cold water. It even grows under the ice. And it also starts out growing very early in the growing season, so it can shade out native species. It can grow in depths from, it's been found, up to 30 feet if the water's clear enough. And milfoil easily propagates. It's brittle, it easily propagates from fragments. It also sets seeds, so it can spread from seeds as well. And it can spread from tiny infestation to a large infestation in just a season or two. The main vector for the spread of AIS is humans, mainly moving boats and other aquatic gear, but mainly boats from water body to water body. So I'm talking about this, and I wanted to start this way to point out the issue, because wake boats are not like other boats. Because of the ballast tanks, and you've heard me mention the ballast tanks, they are not easily cleaned. When a wake boat moves into white sports mode, Jack mentioned, they fill the ballast tanks with a great deal of water. When they're done, they empty that water, but some of the water stays, and then they move to another lake. Now, among the things that make invasive such a big problem is their hardiness. Zebra mussel larvae, the veligers, And fragments of milfoil can survive in small amounts of water within those ballast tanks for days, sometimes even weeks. And that means a boat in an infested lake, fills its ballast tanks, empties it, moves, there's still water and potentially fragments of milfoil, zebra mussel larvae, other things, if there's other things in that lake. They go to the next lake, they fill up again, then they empty. Now, if they move from, say, Bomazine, with its milfoil, zebra mussels, so forth, and go over to Caspian with no invasives, and then they dump those ballast tanks in Caspian, it's very possible. There's milfoil, there's zebra mussels, and as I said, they're very hardy. Because there's no natural predators for these things, they will grow and, very quickly you now have Caspian infested. So it doesn't take much. In fact, it only takes one boat. Also, as mentioned, it's the visual inspection is impossible. You cannot see into the ballast tanks. And it's very difficult to properly decontaminate them because you have to have a special nozzle on the sprayer on the boat wash to get up in there. They're delicate. Some of them have plastic parts. You have to be careful about how hot the water is. Yet it has to be hot enough to kill the invasives. Very few lake associations have been mentioned. We have 5 that have boat washers. And those lake associations raise the money themselves to get those boat washers in place, but they don't have enough water because the water has to be trucked in and they keep it in tanks and there's simply not enough. Many of these boats have maybe 5 ballast tanks, 5 different tanks. You gotta find them. You've got to know that each boat is different, so it's complicated and it takes time.
So the question here.
Yes, so
I just thinking about the mechanics of those boats. If they were banned, I had heard from an earlier witness that those kinds of boats can just be regular motor boats and not use the ballast.
they can be.
So couldn't they still have some water in them even if they're not doing the wake stuff?
Yes.
So that would pose a problem.
It could potentially still pose.
Even if they were not doing the wake sports stuff.
Yes, and that's a concern. That's a concern. We don't think as much because they're not opening and closing ballast tanks, but there's no guarantee that they don't get opening a little bit, the water doesn't seep in, seep out.
Do regular motor boats, don't they collect water as well?
They do, but they can be inspected, they can be cleaned, so if there's a boat washer like the ones we have at the lakes that have them. They can be much more easily cleaned because they can be visually inspected, they can get into, they can open up the different valves that need to be opened easily. Whereas on wake boats, you can't do that because where the ballast tanks are located, it's sometimes problematic. We had one of our wake boat owners come out and walk the readers through where the ballast tanks were on the boat, and they were like, we couldn't find them easily, because they was under the boat, so.
One further question, which I'm afraid I'm gonna lose if I don't ask. For places that have boat washing stations, that's not hot water. If I heard there was a process for, it was just a longer time for wake boats. You could still use not hot water to flush them out. And this is a little bit in the details, but on those boat washing stations, I imagine they're very close to the lake. Does the water that you're flushing out not just go right into the lake?
So the boat washers have to be set a certain number of feet back from the lake, and they have to be set up so they are not draining into the lake.
Okay, all right,
So, yeah,
thank you.
yeah, so it's, so that's part of the requirements when you set them up,
Okay.
so that they don't do that, right? Thank you. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on with the wake. So, our position is allowing wake boats to move from lake to lake without any way to determine if they are properly decontaminated poses a real risk of aquatic invasive species. And again, the chances of any one boat carrying an invasive are much greater than, any one type of other boat. Because that, 5 times, say you got 5 ballast tanks, you got 5 chances on a wake boat. Well, these boats comprise a very small percentage, as Laura mentioned, as far as we know. It only takes one vote on one of our pristine lakes, and we're lucky enough to have many pristine lakes still. For our lake association members in particular, this is a critical problem. Once a lake is infested, the burden and the cost of eradicating, if possible, but more likely controlling and managing an infestation fall primarily on the volunteer lake associations. Agency of Natural Resources staff provide technical expertise and data, as well as adjudication permits, but the vast bulk of the work is on the shoulders of volunteer associations. The state provides a tiny amount of funding in the grant and aid program, and there are some other small grants available. But the burden of accessing and managing those grants, along with raising the rest of the money required, creating lake management and pesticide minimization plans, navigating the permitting process, carrying out the actual projects, all fall to volunteer lake associations. These volunteers also must do outreach and education for local communities and all lake users about best practices to avoid spreading the infestation, carrying it to other water bodies. Plus, they must manage all of the public relations around implementing control programs, which can be especially difficult and acrimonious if the use of aquatic herbicide is proposed. And I'm sure some of you have heard about some of that. The costs alone to manage a milfoil infestation, and this is not counting the hundreds, maybe thousands of volunteer hours that are donated, can amount to $50,000 to $100,000 per year. And once invested in a lake, this work and these costs continue every year in perpetuity, in fact, increase. This is on top of all the other work lake associations already do, working with the members, and I won't go into all of that, but I think some of you have heard much of what lake associations do. And we undertake this work because we believe that it is the duty and responsibility of all of us to protect our environment and our precious natural resources. So I'm not saying this to complain, but I do want to point out that our concern about allowing any activity that presents yet another risk to further the spread of aquatic invasives is not trivial. We already have the home lake provision, it's in the rule is in effect. Yet ANR did not implement it last year and have announced they're not going to implement it this year. Since there's no way to guarantee that wake boats carrying aquatic invasives can be properly cleaned and that they will be properly cleaned, we believe that wake boats should be told that they can stay on one and only one lake for the 2025 season. We don't quite agree with completely banning, but we don't think they should be allowed to move from lake to lake at all. In addition, we urge at some point this body to clarify the intent of 10 VSA 1454 Part C, which is on the little excerpt is on your handout. That the intent of that is actually to prevent the spread of aquatic invasives. And that boats that do not comply with the necessary inspections and decontamination shall not enter the waters of the state. We believe this is implied by the wording of 10 VSA 1454, but it could be made clearer. And we'd love to see that made very, very explicit. We also think that clarification is needed to be clear with ANR that it is allowable for breeders to explain this to boaters and to request that they comply with inspection and or decontamination. If they do not, we think breeders should be able to tell the boater they may not enter the water. No, they can't enforce, they can't write a ticket, but they are being told right now that they can't even say that they may not. And we think they should be able to tell voters, you're not supposed to go in the water. Especially because of the invasive problem. You've heard about the 10 lakes that have already submitted petitions. We continue to be concerned about that. We can't, obviously, these efforts will not ensure absolutely that there's no risk. Fishing accesses are open 24/7. We can have breeders on duty around the clock. Boats can and do enter the lakes when there's no one available to inspect them, to decontaminate them. But we do think that more effort can be made to reduce the risk, and we think it should be made, particularly in this case. So I just ask, to consider full implementation of the home lake rule, at least in terms of keeping boats on one lake only this summer, and to clarify some of these rules. So I'll stop there because I know I have time short. I know other people are ready to speak, but we have to answer their questions if you have them. Or if you want to email me the questions, happy to answer those, but I did give you some links to, a couple of articles too, and some other material. That might be helpful, I think backs up what we're talking about in terms of AIS. So.
Thanks so much. And have you sent your testimony to?
And I did send everything,
Great.
sorry, it's a little late.
Super, thank you. Oh, and I meant to ask Mr. Winnis, you did reference some studies. I'm wondering if you could send those along to our committee system as well.
Reference studies, well,
Oh, studies about, well, I can look back.
I
at my.
sent the PowerPoint that has links to
Yeah.
some of those,
Oh, it did have some links. to
but
it.
I don't know exactly which ones.
Oh, about the residual amount of
Sure.
gallons in a tank, even
Sure.
after washing or flushing or something. So
I can be sure to send that.
that'd be great. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we have Mr. Cease. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
And after that is Mr. Hill.
Hi, thanks. I'm Steve Cease. I know the chair very well as a over 10 years mayor of my city, Montclair. I'm glad to have the chance to appear in front of you all. As I said, I live in Montclair. I'm 78 years old. I've been a paddler in Vermont and other venues for probably close to 60 years. And today I'd like to talk about the issue of safety. Earlier, I sent the committee a longer piece touching off a number of points on why I think wake sports, in my opinion, should be prohibited from Vermont as in the lakes. But I'd like to spend more time this morning talking about safety from the vantage point of the paddler. I paddle a small solo canoe these days. My wife paddles a kayak. We are not lake owners. We are in the habit with friends of traveling to different lakes around the state and rivers for day outings. And I think we're in the same situation, not in the same boat as thousands of other canoeists, kayakers, paddleboarders, fisher anglers who trailer their small boats to different lakes to fish. And for us, and for me, in my opinion, wake sports is a significant hazard and almost a life-threatening hazard to people like me. A little background, DNR and others have talked about the situation regarding the present rule regarding wake sports and the lake. And Jack Witness talked about the process by which the agency adopted its current rule. During the rulemaking process, as Jack noted, hundreds of people testified and sought very stringent protection for paddlers. And there were other reasons, of course, for asking for protections from wake sports, but paddling in particular drew the attention of hundreds and hundreds of people, including me and a number of my friends. The issue with paddling and small boat use is the large waves that wake boats produce. The waves are, from a standpoint of a small boater, a kayaker or a canoeist, they're gigantic. 5 feet seemed to be a desirable height a few years ago for wake sports. And as we know, or as I've read at least, the literature from wake boat manufacturers are advertising even higher, 6 feet and even greater. And we know that's the kind of progression for enthusiasts of an athletic event. You always want to have bigger, better, faster events. But from the standpoint of a traditional user of a little canoe or kayak, that's a daunting prospect. If you picture yourself in a canoe or a kayak, and I hope many of you have had that pleasure, or a small sailboat, you're sitting in a kayak on the bottom of your boat, or in a canoe, maybe a foot or so from the bottom of the boat. A 5-foot wave would be like possibly 2 feet above your head. A 3-foot wave would be an island. Those are really daunting prospects for me and for most of the people I know. That's a terrifying prospect. And you're faced with, how am I going to survive this? If you survive it. From my standpoint, I'm sure I'd capsize if a wave of 4 to 5 feet approached my boat. Probably a 3-footer is simply. A racer on a kayak might provide you some protection for a smaller wave, but it's not a guarantee. And a swim in a Vermont lake on your own, or could be a life-threatening situation. If you're a swimmer, picture yourself swimming in an open lake, and there are a lot of open water swimmers in this state. the prospect of a 5-foot wave is really scary. That's a guaranteed trip through the washing machine, and you don't know how it's gonna look out. So from the standpoint of a paddler, the waves produced by these boats are really treacherous. And I'd like to distinguish, I mean, there are a number of issues that we've heard today about the ballast tanks and wake boats. A wake boat operating in a conventional mode doesn't present the same kind of wake as it is in a wake sport mode. So in conventional operation, they don't impose the same kind of concern that I've talked about for wake sport. A conventional wake is a relatively manageable situation, but by contrast, the big wakes are pretty dreadful. Now, I've talked about the standpoint of perhaps an individual boater on their own encountering a big wave. I've heard a lot of reliable reports, and we may hear today from others about multiple wake boats operating on a lake at one time. I've heard that they produce just a maelstrom on the surface of the lake, and that is the situation that no small boater, paddle boarder, swimmer, angler wants to find themselves in. Now, the ANR, when it adopted its rule, completely sidestepped the issue of safety. Numbers of people testified, as I said, seeking stringent protection from wake sports for paddling. The ANR, as others mentioned, said, we don't have expertise in safety, so we're just going to stick with the present statute, which imposes a 200-foot distance from a boat producing a wake or operating at more than 5 miles an hour from a swimmer or another object in the lake. In my opinion, that's woefully insufficient. Yet it's the situation that we're facing going into this summer. Situation we had last year, and we'll get at it again in 2025. So I've said facetiously, the small craft warnings are flying again this year. Now, the small boaters had better beware that they may encounter wake boats if they travel to a lake for a day's outing. Some people have said because the agency imposed a 500-foot boundary for other reasons from shorelines, that provides a kind of a safety zone where people can paddle or swim. But I say that's a specious argument, and I think it really undermines or underscores why wake sports have an exclusionary effect on other water users. I don't know of any small boater or sailor, maybe some, who are content with paddling around a 500-foot perimeter around the lake. But if you're a small boat sailor, a sunfish, a sailfish, imagine how many times you're gonna have to tack or go about if you're sticking in that 500-foot perimeter. It's not a fun prospect. And for that matter, if a wake boat is operating in wake sport mode just outside that 500-foot perimeter, those waves are gonna roll in regardless. So it seems to me that arguing that the 500-foot zone is a safety zone simply says you're at risk going out of the broad surface of the lake, and those wake boats out there have excluded your use of that area, which we should remind ourselves is managed by the state for the public trust, for the benefit of all users, and not for the specific benefit of one narrow component of the voting public. So I think that wake boat operators and wake sport enthusiasts do have options. People mentioned that Memphis, Magog, and Champlain are international lakes, and we have no jurisdiction in Vermont over those lakes. I believe the big Chattanooga River reservoirs are also not regulated by Vermont, and they provide yet another venue for wake sporters. I guess that's the word, wake sporters. So I think that there are options for wake boaters, even if Vermont does ban the use of wake sports or the practice of wake sports on inland lakes. So I think those are some of the principal reasons that I have as a paddler for suggesting that the state take legislative action to prohibit wake sports on our inland lakes. I think the danger, the unnatural conditions produced by these giant lakes, the exclusion of traditional users, small boaters, paddlers who've been paddling on these lakes for hundreds of years, and in my lifetime, and we are at risk. And I will tell you that I would not drive to a lake where wake sports are permitted, because I don't know if I'm going to find a wake boat there. There's absolutely no way to know if a wake boat's out there. And if a wake boat is there, I don't want to be on the same lake. And I think I speak for many small voters in the same position. So thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this. It's an issue for many of us who love our Vermont lakes. And I look forward to the next session when maybe we'll see some legislation addressing the issue. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, question.
Yes, sir.
Have you ever been capsized or has it, have documentation of others being?
I personally have not. A good friend of mine who might be watching this on Zoom has testified in the past that he was washed off his paddleboard on Waterbury Reservoir.
Okay.
And I have seen a wake boat in the distance, but the thing I think the surfer was having trouble. So the wake boat wasn't really operating. So I was managed to get to a no wake zone before the boat fired up, but I have not.
Okay.
There are many stories. I hope you hear some good.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is raising a question for me. It's reminding me of the hardest class I took in college, which was fluid dynamics. And wondering about, this might be a question for the folks from DEC, but thinking about or if anybody happens to know, the dampening rate. So if you start with a 5-foot wake.
Yeah.
How far out do you need to go before it is
Well,
2 feet?
as you probably know, when a boat is operating and produces waves, it produces what's called a wake chain. And there are successive waves behind that initial wave that also spread out behind the boat.
Yeah.
And they definitely dissipate. I said, from my standpoint, that I don't know if I actually said this, that an 18-inch or 2-foot wave could be daunting for me in a canoe.
Yeah.
But I don't know at what rate they diminish. I will say that the succeeding wave chain behind that initial wave poses its own threats because it produces a bunch of progressively smaller waves that also bounce you around and tip you over.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Did you submit that testimony?
This is just a really rough draft.
Yeah,
I can polish it up and submit it. Thank you, David, for that. Thanks.
All right, Mr. Dodd, thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. It's nice at this time of year to think about actually getting out on lakes here in the coming months. My name is Phil Dodd. I live in Montpelier. I'm not a lakefront property owner. But like thousands of Vermonters and Vermont visitors, I take day trips to recreate on our beautiful lakes. The Vermonters I'm talking about are swimmers, paddlers, anglers, sailors, and motorboat owners. I feel confident in saying that as a general rule, we don't like wake boats when used for lake sports. Wake boats are not like traditional motorboats. And I did print a few photos off the internet. I thought I'd pass these around just to see, you can see what the boats are like and what kind of waves they can create. They have wake plates to lower the stern into the water to create a bigger, broader wake. The most notable feature of wake boats are their ballast tanks. Either, as we've heard, they either have hard ballast tanks or soft bags designed to be filled with water. Many wake boats can carry up to 3,000 pounds of water ballast, or about 1.5 tons, and some carry more. We've heard how these can carry invasive species. Joe's Pond had milfoil turn up last summer for the first time. There's some speculation it could be a result of a wake boat, but there's no proof of that. In my opinion, wake boats are bad for Vermont lakes. They can erode shorelines, damage boats tied to docks, stir up phosphorus and disturb plants on lake bottoms, adversely impact wildlife, and they are potentially dangerous for other lake users. And that's what I'd like to focus on. As we've heard, the department was not able to focus on safety, particularly they didn't feel they had the expertise. So I think it's something that has not been considered enough. My wife and I are in our mid-70s and own 2 kayaks. These particular kayaks are really small packed canoes. We sit on the bottom and paddle them like kayaks. Boats are tender, so a sudden big wave from the wake boat could easily capsize me and fill the canoe with water. Not a happy prospect for the skeezer. I also have a sunfish that I take by trailer to sail on Vermont lakes. That too could easily be capsized. At the other end of this age spectrum, my 6- and 8-year-old granddaughters have their own kayaks. They are learning fast, but I know they couldn't handle a sudden 2 to 4 to 5 foot wave. If my daughter, who has her own kayak, took them to a lake where one or more wake boats was operating, I'm sure she would turn around and drive home, fearing the lake would not be safe for her family. A friend of mine who was a place on Joe's Pond said that when the wake boats come out there, he has to tell his grandchildren to come to shore. If they're out paddling or sailing or swimming off a boat, it's not safe for them to stay in a lake. This does not seem fair. Why should our lakes at times be essentially off limits to those? The majority by far who want to fish, kayak, canoe, paddleboard, sail, swim, water ski, or use their normal motorboats or pontoon boats. The legislature has in the past expressed interest in keeping lakes safe. When it directed the Agency of Natural Resources to write rules governing Vermont lakes, it said, among other things, quote, "The purposes of these rules shall be to further the maintenance of safe and healthful conditions." That's 10 VSA section 1421. When used for wake boats, for wake sports, wake boats are unsafe for traditional and normal lake users, those that were in existence in 1994, on Vermont's relatively small inland lakes because of these large waves. In my view, wake sports using wake boats should be prohibited by legislative action. Even with a ban, as we've heard, they would still be allowed on international waters like Champlain, Lake Magog, and Connecticut reservoirs. In particular, Lake Champlain, where I've sailed many times on larger boats, that's an appropriate place for wake boats. That lake already has sometimes very large waves caused by big cabin cruisers. The lake is big enough for wake boats to go a long way in one direction without going back and forth as they must on inland lakes. The state has long sought to protect its lakes and their uses. We don't allow people to overnight on their boats on inland lake. We have maximum speed limits. We don't allow high speeds within 200 feet of shore or swimmers or other boats. We don't allow trees and bushes to be cut on the water's edge. And ponds, or those who use them, we prohibit it.
For water quality purposes, I'm serving under Bethany. And I've also been for that duration a loon observer for Vermont Center for Eco Studies in cooperation with the states. And to just correct the Vermont, the Native Fish Coalition state chapter, no longer serve as chair. My advocacy work is produced long association with Fish and Wildlife staff. So when Fish and Wildlife issued a position paper on the 9 petitions to protect their individual lakes in February of this year, I took notice. The remarks by Fish and Wildlife staff unfortunately belittled the concerns voiced by those petitions. From my viewpoint as a long-time water quality and fishery advocate, Fish and Wildlife position was deeply disappointing. It did not reflect the commitment and professionalism of the scientists I know at Fish and Wildlife Department. As a result, in March, I initiated a public records request. In early April, Fish and Wildlife staff produced 321 documents related to the petitions and use of public water rules dating back to 2023. I thank staff for their cooperation. Let me delve into details about wake boats, sports, and Fish and Wildlife staff remarks about them, interspersed with my own comments. First concern, harm to aquatic habitat in the food chain. Quoting a position paper by staff fishery biologists written in December of last year, quote, wake sports represent a new and potentially greater threat to fishing and fish. Potential negative effects of wake boats include turbulence that displaces fish eggs, juvenile fish, and macroinvertebrates, disturbance of aquatic plants, increased turbidity, and spread of aquatic invasive species. This document provides comments in favor of petitions to prohibit wake sports on those 10 lakes in this fish districts 3 and 5, which is predominantly the Northeast Kingdom. Separately, the November 24th, this is not related to Fish and Wildlife. And Senator Watson, I can provide you a copy with this 2024 study published in November concerning lakes in Connecticut that documents wave dissipation and bottom disturbance with all the scientific method applied to it. Pretty fascinating. But in that case, the point I noted is that the wake boats, egg beater like downward thrust, disturb bottoms to 26 feet, unlike Vermont's rule, which protects waters only to 20 feet. Second concern, water quality, quoting a Fish and Wildlife biologist on the pending petitions he wrote in November 2024. There are two reasons to ban wake boats on these waters. One, aquatic invasive exotics, particularly in Echo, the Agles, Cascade, Shadow, Parker, and Willoughby Lakes. Number two, lake trout populations. Sediment from wake boats might disturb the spawning substrate. There's no void in the oxygen when sediment covers the lake trout eggs. And lake trout, incidentally, commonly spawn in shoal waters between 15 and 25 feet in our cold water lakes. Third concern, aquatic invasive species. I think Pat already addressed those adequately, but there's a quote by one of the biologists also in November last year who has a PhD in fishery management, quote, wake boats are more impactful to fish and fish habitat because they utilize ballast water, which can never be fully drained. Ballast water is a vector for aquatic invasive species. There are nearly 50 non-native aquatic species already established in Vermont. About 100 of Vermont's 800 plus lakes are currently infested with aquatic invasive species. Fourth concern, loons. This is my own opinion. I personally have spent decades monitoring loon activities at Holland and its backward ponds. Loons are excellent swimmers, but clumsy on land. Their nests are often just 4 to 12 vertical inches from shoreline because they can barely clamber about. A single wave will inundate a loon egg and ruin their annual reproduction. It can be that simple. Fifth, and this was an eye-opener, enforcement issues. Quoting a ANR staff meeting decontamination study in January of this year, quote from those minutes, wardens currently are unable to issue citations related to wake boats or wake sport violations. Another quote from a warden with boating enforcement responsibilities writing to the Vermont State Police Marine Patrol, quote, we can't even enforce the law right now. My limited knowledge here suggests that there's some statutory regulatory complications that it created a technicality where the Fish and Wildlife wardens and the Marine Patrol for the state police say we don't have authority. So by the time Fish and Wildlife sent its official position paper in February.
Sorry,
Laura?
can I interrupt you real quick? There's a question here.
Go ahead.
There is jurisdiction problem.
Pardon?
There's a jurisdiction problem between, I think it's the state police that actually enforces. The Fish and Wildlife are on the waters.
As I understand it, the complication may evolve from the fact that the Water Resources Board and perhaps another regulatory agency once managed the use of public water rules that got shifted to DEC, and therein is a complication for enforcement.
Thank you.
The concern, I made many quotations from quoting the fishery biologists that I know. And by the time the position paper from Fish and Wildlife reached Laura, the DEC Lakes and Ponds Division, their concerns were basically neutralized or at least minimized, which was highly disappointing. So I'll sum up. The point here is that wake sports are problematic on Vermont's inland lakes. They are disruptive to the environment and normal uses. To Senator Watson, who asked about hierarchy earlier, if I understood your question, it's not just hierarchy among recreational users, but perhaps priorities on how you establish the rules. And if you read the mission statements for Forest Parks and Recreation, for Fish and Wildlife, for the Department of Environmental Conservation, And the first paragraph is protect, preserve the environment foremost. So highlighting that, I personally would endorse legislation to emerge next session to protect our lakes and ban, or excuse me, prohibit wake sports on Vermont's inland lakes.
What's the difference
Wake boats or wake sports,
between ban and prohibit? Is there a difference or?
it's semantic.
It's kinder.
I'll talk with you and not to you.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah. Another question?
Well, I just
For comment?
thank you for, I was gonna ask you about once I saw that you were former president of the Fish Association, I was gonna ask you about the impact on animals, because we'd heard on people, on plants, but hadn't heard, and I assumed that if they were problematic for birds nesting and fish, I can imagine fish feeling like they're in a churn when something like that happens. And I'm not a fish, but that.
My interest is predominantly aquatic, and that's where the loons live, and I can't speak to other
Yeah.
mammals and such.
Yeah, well, and to follow up on that, to the degree that you have studies about, I mean, you mentioned the study about that was done in lakes in Connecticut, you know, things like that. The studies are useful, so if you can pass along any links to that, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay, and all right, so we are up to Mr. Downey. Mr. Gagne? No?
Yes.
He's here. Are you Mr. Gagne?
No.
No. Okay. Okay.
I'll take his place.
Okay.
I believe he might have tried to get in by Zoom, but I don't know if that's the case. Is
I didn't,
that true, Jack?
I didn't
That's
see,
what he was gonna try to do, he's in Florida, so.
yeah, you know,
Oh,
I mean, you didn't ask to be admitted.
Okay. All right, so I realize you probably have something to say about this. Would you like an opportunity to testify? If you can keep it brief, that would be great. Yes, yes, and could you tell us your name for the record?
My name is Eric Shipton, and I know I'll get the question, I'll say yes, my nephew is from.
Oh.
So I'll be pretty quick, but I got a couple of, I took some notes down for this, and I feel bad that I didn't. Put the sign up earlier for it. I'll be very specific in a very narrow area here. I know that the feeling of over legislating and the stuff that goes through your mind as you do this is you don't want to over legislate, you want to be careful. So I have about 55 years of in the maritime industry. I just retired with my 50-year certificate of the International Organization of Masters Masons Pilots. And during that time, I have had the experience of going up every river that goes to a major city in America, from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Jacksonville, up to Seattle, Washington. When we talk about being careful, our legislation here is not, we're not over legislating, I can tell you that. And just last week down in Florida, which is a pretty red state, and most of these places that I'm talking about are red states. The equivalent to when we protect blooms, trying to, and they're trying to protect manatees. I don't know if anybody's read about the boat accident last week in Florida. Well, if you Google that, you're going to find that first thing that comes up if you kill a manatee, which this person may have, is prison time. There are no, there's no legislation for that, like that. Secondly, a very stiff bond. So, those are some of the current concerns that I have. I also Googled every single one of these forests because I've been on them. I know them, especially the Mississippi River. And I was asking, are wake boats allowed and so on? Well, they're totally banned I believe, in San Francisco Harbor. And these are all, by the way, rivers that go open up into the ocean. We're not talking just a lake. I don't care how big the lake is in Vermont. They're smaller than any of these entrances to the ocean. So there are on every one of them very serious notice. And I want to mention that when they say no wake zone, Google Boston, you do not disobey these orders, especially down south. You will be penalized. But every single one of these places, these rivers, has some serious limits. But I don't have much more to say. I just had to bring that out there because it's looking at these, making these laws from your eyes. I could, I think you need to feel comfortable that you're not. I don't care what kind of a law you pass in Vermont, you are not over legislating.
Thank you so much. And a question.
What will the Connecticut River, when they wake those in?
Yes.
Can I just,
Yes.
before you leave, Mr. Whitman,
Sure.
just to be clear, so you're saying that if we were to make the wake boat rules stricter, or even, as someone else said, prohibit them, you don't think that would be over legislating?
I don't.
Because it's done in other parts of the
That's
country.
because if you look at even our largest lakes, they're still pretty small, and we have not come up yet with a system for compliance and penalties. I mean, I'd like to know, it was, I mean, a year ago, I believe, last April to this April, this stuff, since it's been legalized on some lakes. And I would like to know if the agency could tell us how many violations of these places. There's no record. Now, I have a solution to this, by the way. It's called One Step GPS. This company tracks probably 10,000 track trails. What it would do, it would take a wake boat zone, and the operator would have to buy a $95 widget. It's 4 pounds, 4 ounces. They can put every single lake that has a wake boat zone into that. It's connected to your ignition. And so when they start the boat, and it would start tracking. And if you go over the zone, it would call him up. And it would call up anybody, like, for example, A&R didn't want to deal with it. Once you set this up, it takes 2 to 4 weeks, and all of these lakes would be covered. And you can put as many phone numbers on there as you want. For our lake, I would like to be called. So when you cross the line on that, you would get a phone call. It'd be a little thing. This is not invasive in any way that I look for the least invasive thing. I'll tell you what is invasive is that on April 24th, Barry passed a law that had cameras on every telephone pole in downtown Barry. That's invasive, but it's for safety, so you accept it. And we need to accept something like this for the safety of other users. And you're absolutely right, those who spoke about not going into the waters of Waterbury Reservoir. You get up to 1,000 paddlers a weekend, and I've heard 1,500. And I'm telling you right now, because we're go up to Umiak and Stowe and talk to Steve Brownlee, he will tell you that he gets phone calls, and if you say that wake boats are just allowed on there, they won't come. So they're going to other lakes. And I believe we heard a couple of people say that they will go to these lakes and they wake boats. So thank you for that.
Thank you. It sounds like an economic development issue. Yeah.
Well, just a couple questions, Mr. Chinton. This device you're talking about, does it have the ability to know if the boat is operating in wake sport mode or not, or?
I've asked that question, and it could be figured out. They would send their team in California, so there's 2 costs here. There's the 95% thing. At our last board meeting, I got dressed out very well by my own people. So I ended up making a list of all of the no-nos and all of the things that we have to pay for, only I have my CDL. I can't tell you how many hundreds of dollars it's cost me for the training and for the insurance and the physical. And so it's a lot of these things that you want to do in life, you pay for. So what was the question again? I'm sorry.
The question was whether this device, would it know if you were in wake sport mode or not?
Okay, I asked that very question about them, and they are, their team, 2 or 3 people will come. They say it take about 2 weeks to accommodate every lake that works legal right now. And I look at this thing as just a bridge, not a final answer to anything, because I would hate to see this voted into place just because this is there. But they can work that out. They have a way of working that out, and then the user, if he feels like he's been taken advantage of, can also challenge it too. So, but it would go, one of the people who would get this would probably be a police officer in the Williston barracks. And he or she would be the one that sends the violation out. And so I mean, personally, check on the manatees, our loons. We've essentially, when it comes to the loons, my wife right now, by the way, with Eric Hans's crew, is on the Waterbed Reservoir, that's out there for the loon nesting. And see you out in a moment. I'm not going to take any more of your time. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, well, thanks everybody for being here, and we'll see about further conversation next session or next year. So we're gonna switch gears now to look at a new draft of H 396, which is Molly Beatty Distinguished Service Award.
No votes. So, yours. I'm the way, no way, folks. So are they on Howland Pond now? That's usually very quiet. No, it is.
Oh,
wait.
yeah, it's very fast. Okay, welcome. Yes, go right ahead.
Good morning, members of the committee. My name is Michael Chernick. I'm from Legislative Council, and we have been back and forth on H 396 several times over the last, I say, month now. And this record presents a series of changes and cleanups based upon my testimony late last week. And we go directly into it. What it does is section 1 and 2, section 2 is just the effective date. Section 1 is a substantive section. And I'll read it over again slowly one more time to make sure everyone is now in agreement on what it should say. The title is the Molly B. Distinguished Service Award, and I will mention, as I had before, the award would be a plaque or a certificate. It's a very de minimis amount of money involved in this. In commemoration of the centennial of the Vermont State Parks and the Department of Forests, Parks and Recreation, and in honor of the conservation and public land accessibility values of the late former Commissioner of Forests, Parks and Recreation, Molly B., there is created the Molly B. Distinguished Service Award. Annually, the Commissioner of Forests, Parks and Recreation shall present the award to either a current or former state employee or partner whose contribution honor the legacy of Molly B. in advancing the conservation, accessibility, and quality of recreational experience in sustainability of Vermont's public, or sustainability rather, of Vermont's public lands. And then an effective date of July 1, which is the standard effective date for the bill. And I think I caught all the issues that were raised last week.
Okay. Because it looks good to me. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Okay. Great.
All right, let's see it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Is there a motion?
I move to approve draft 4.1 as amended. the H396.
sorry.
No, we need a second, actually. We do it second.
Right.
Beatty and Beatty can get the different Beatties and babies pronounce it one way or the other. She was Beatty.
Oh, she's baby,
Yeah,
oh, Molly baby.
I always.
same language, but a lot of people pronounce it Beatty. Some people with that name pronounce it Beatty, some pronounce it Beatty.
Yeah.
She was one.
Yeah.
So
Did you ever
how
overlap?
does Molly, how's this one?
Beatty, she's Molly, it's a Beatty, she's Molly Beatty. No, not Beatty, Beatty. Beatty's a Beatty.
Baby. Did you ever overlap her work?
Yeah, that's what I love.
Did you? Oh, you did?
All right, are we ready?
Yes.
Okay, Senator Betts, yes, Senator Baumgartner.
Yes.
Senator Hardy,
Yes.
Senator Williams.
Yeah.
Senator Watson.
Yes.
Okay, 5-0.
Okay, and. Oh, yeah, oh, no, way.
No, you
Oh my
did
gosh.
one.
Do you want to?
Sure.
Okay.
You should, you do, you're
Then
the
we
one
knew
of us
us,
who
you
knew
knew
her.
her.
Yeah.
Would you?
Okay. Oh, you're okay to record this?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, that's great.
All right.
Jimmy, that was,
Pretty vote was 5-0.
yep,
Correct. Yeah.
okie dokie, great, so. That is the end of our agenda for today, so with that, we will adjourn.